You're listening to the Adventurous Reinvention podcast. I'm Allison Boyle, aka She Dreams of Alpine, and this is the show that's dedicated to all the adventurous spirits out there who have either been transformed by the outdoors or are interested in what it looks like to step into a new, adventurous, and courageous kind of identity in their life. It doesn't matter what your background is in the outdoors, what age you're starting at, or where you grew up. If you're curious about the outdoors and using adventure as a way to reinvent yourself, you're in the right place. I'll be sharing all kinds of personal adventure stories, lessons I've learned from the mountains, teaching what I know about the outdoors and leadership, and interviewing some amazing adventurous women all along the way. I've been coaching women on becoming safe, confident, and self-sufficient backpackers and leaders of their own adventurous lives since 2018, and I know exactly what big fears and self-doubts can pop up along the way. I have so much to share with you, so let's dive in. Okay, hello. Welcome to episode 15 of the Adventurous Reinvention podcast. I am your host, Allison, and today we're diving into a topic that is top of mind for many of my clients right now. And so I thought you might find it interesting as well. And that's planning for a 2025 summit of Mount Whitney. Now, we're getting into permit season for many popular hiking and backpacking trails here in the US, particularly for areas in the western part of the US. And one of the most popular hikes in the United States is the Mount Whitney hike and getting to the top of this iconic peak because it is the tallest peak in the lower 48 states. So it stands at 14,500 feet tall, just for a little bit of data for you data nerds out there. The main hike, so the Mount Whitney hike via the main trail, it is about 22 miles round trip and has an elevation gain of about 6,145 feet. So around 6,000 to 7,000 feet, depending on all the little side adventures that you might take, would be what you should expect to have in your Mount Whitney summit. This is a bucket list hike for many adventurers all over the world, as you can imagine, but it's also a challenge that requires a lot of preparation, strategy, and oftentimes a lot of luck, right? There are weather situations that you might get into, wildfire situations. They're not always on your side when it comes to the summit. And especially a lot of people can deal with altitude sickness. Maybe this is their first peak at altitude and they're just not used to it, right? Many of the even most prepared, or maybe even more, they consider themselves pretty fit hikers, often get turned away from the summit because it is a very challenging peak, even if it isn't as technically challenging as some peaks in the Eastern Sierras. And when I say that, I mean like you can hike it. It's a class 1 trail to the top of the summit, and so it's relatively easy to get to in the summer. Easy with quotation marks because it's not easy in other regards. So we're going to cover in this episode, I'm going to share everything that you need to know to make a Mount Whitney summit a reality. And I'm going to cover how to get a permit, some of the lessons that I've learned from my own personal successes and failures on Mount Whitney. And I'm also going to share some practical tips for tackling your first 14er, whether that's Mount Whitney or another peak. So even if you don't want to summit Mount Whitney, there's a lot that you can gain from this episode. So let's dive in, shall we? The first thing that I want to talk about is permits. Because literally right now, as this episode is releasing, now is the time to be thinking about grabbing a Mount Whitney permit. Because Mount Whitney is such a high, trafficked area in the Eastern Sierras, the Forest Service has implemented a permit system in order to preserve the wilderness and manage the foot traffic and all the things, right? So there are actually approximately 30,000 people that attempt a summit of Mount Whitney each year, which is a lot of people. But only about 10,000 of those climbers reach the summit every year. So that is about a 1/3 success rate. So I just want you to remember that stat as we kind of go through this episode, because if you've ever attempted the summit and you had to turn around, it's normal. Like, it happens to a lot of people. I have gone on Mount Whitney trips and not summited, and I'm going to share more of that. And as you can see, with 30,000 people attempting to summit, Whitney gets a lot of traffic, even with the permit system in place. So permits are required year-round for the main trail, the Mountaineers route. Even if you're coming in from the backside, you have to get a permit, though it's slightly different permitting process. The peak season for when it's most competitive to get permits would be like May through October season. But sidebar, like if you are wanting to really give yourself a good chance of getting a summit of Mount Whitney, I would recommend narrowing that to even more July, like mid-July, to maybe late September at the latest. That is going to be typically your best months at avoiding snow, and especially if you don't have those technical skills to deal with snow and you don't want to have to like deal with that, that's like the best time to be out there. September is always my ideal month to do things in the Sierras because I love the fall weather, but wildfires are always a risk, and that can happen anytime in the summer as well. So sometimes that is unavoidable, but that's just my little tip on choosing a season. May, unless you have mountaineering skills, I would say it's probably too dangerous for most people to be attempting a summit. It's probably going to be too much snow, too technical. October, you're risking it being really cold, and also, again, snow. It just depends on the season. There are definitely some years when there are less snow. So how to apply? The permit lottery opens February 1st. And it closes March 15th. So they have a lottery. At first, they have a lottery that you can apply to every year. So we're in that lottery section right now. So if you've been thinking like, oh, I want to do something challenging this year, put your name in the hat for the lottery right now. Like you can just put it out there, see if the universe grants you some permits, and maybe that would be your sign to take a Mount Whitney summit, right? Or to train for it, to like rally for it, right? And you can apply at recreation.gov for that lottery permit. And then after the lottery closes, it doesn't mean that you can't get a permit after that. They are just more on a first come, first serve kind of rolling basis-ish. I'm not going to go into all the details here because the permit system is complicated. We do have a blog post that goes into more detail about it. But my biggest tip is to be flexible. So when you're applying, choose multiple entry dates to increase your chances of getting a spot, and have a smaller group, and also think about doing weekdays if you can. So that is going to be how to apply. There are some different types of permits to consider getting. A day use permit is those of you who want to do Mount Whitney in a day as a single day ascent and descent. That means you're going up and you're coming back in the same day. But remember, it's 22 miles round trip and over 6,000 feet of gain. That is a lot for most people. Like, unless you're an ultra marathoner and you're doing those big miles all the time, that is a lot for most hikers. I personally recommend doing an overnight permit if you can. So that would be where you are backpacking, and if you have the backpacking skills, right? There's pros and cons to each, but I think people have more success when they do it as an overnight thing, right? Because not only are you getting to acclimatize, which is one of the biggest reasons people have to turn around, is because they feel altitude sick. But you're also breaking up kind of that elevation gain and mileage. And your summit day, you can leave a base camp and you can go up summit with a lighter pack and come back and then go back with your heavier pack. So there's day use permits, overnight permits. There's also permits that you can get from different trailheads to approach Mount Whitney from the backside. That is a different permit system. That would be the Inyo National Forest permit that you'd be grabbing. But there's a lot of different ways that you can get a permit. And there are alternate options, kind of like I just mentioned. If you don't get a permit, look for cancellations later in the season. Again, consider hiking to the top of Mount Whitney from the backside of Mount Whitney. So not from the main area where everyone enters, but from the back. So for instance, a lot of people will come in from Cottonwood Lakes or Cottonwood Pass or maybe Onion Valley, and then they will hike to the backside of Mount Whitney and maybe exit Mount Whitney portal area. So that's something that many people often do as well. And again, I have so many more details about this all in a permit guide on Mount Whitney, specifically on my blog. It's how to get Mount Whitney permits. You can find that at shedreamsofalpine.com/blog. And then if you just type in Mount Whitney, that should come up for you. And I'll also make sure to link that in the show notes. Now, I lived in California for About 7 years. So I spent a lot of that time in the Eastern Sierras. And I also had several trips that involved a Mount Whitney summit. Not all of them were successful, but some of them were. And so I'm going to dive into some of those stories really quick and share my lessons from each trip. Because I personally believe, you guys have heard me say this before, but the mountains are always teaching us something valuable. So even a failed summit attempt has so much value to teach us. Okay, so my very first trip to Mount Whitney was in 2014. And if you remember my story from one of my very first podcasts, like how I got into the outdoors, I told you that year was 2013. So this was like shortly, maybe a year or less than a year after my very first backpacking trip. I did the Mountaineers route. And this was my very first Mount Whitney experience. It was also one of my second mountaineering trips. Because I had gone all in on this, like, I want to learn to be self-sufficient, learn all the skills, I had joined this mountaineering club that was actually based in Utah. It no longer exists, but I would literally drive to Utah almost every single weekend. Not every weekend, but like multiple times a month, like maybe once or twice a month, to do things with that club to get the valuable learning and mentorship and experience. But one of their summits that they wanted to do was Mount Whitney. And so that was in my kind of home base because I was living in California at the time. And they were doing it in the spring via the Mountaineers route. So this was a mountaineering attempt at the summit. It was not like a day hike. It wasn't the typical route that many people take. In the summer, you guys usually are doing the switchbacks. But it is an excellent route for mountaineering when it's good snow. So if you have those skill sets and you feel confident in that, that is definitely something to consider as well. And the permits are a lot less competitive when you're in that season, right? So I was still learning a lot about mountaineering at the time. So this trip at this point in my outdoorsy journey was really, really challenging for me, but ironically, I did make the summit of Mount Whitney. Now, the biggest lessons I learned from this trip were, for me, this was such a hard trip. So I learned that I am capable of so much more than I think I am. And like, I can do hard things. That was validated in this trip because it was long. It was the first time I ever used like technical snowshoes on steep terrain. I learned and practiced so many of my mountaineering skills because again, this was only my second Mountaineers trip and it was a pretty like bigger one than the other one I had done. I also learned that when we did this trip, it was like a big group of us, but then we kind of paced out into smaller groups. And so I was kind of in the back with a slower group because at the time I wasn't very fast. And so our small group, we were lagging behind. You know, the weather had been good for most of the day, but then it got kind of bad. And we made it to the summit and we quickly realized that we had not been seeing the clouds that were coming. And when we got to the summit, we were completely covered in clouds and we couldn't see anything. Like we had no summit views. And basically we were like up there feeling really panicked, like, oh my gosh, what are we doing up here? We need to get off the summit. And that's not a good place to be. You don't want to be on the top of the summit being worried about getting off the summit. So I learned from that trip, like to pay much more attention to storms and the clouds rolling in. That was a really important lesson that I learned. We just turned around like immediately and got off the summit as quickly and as safely as we could. But it probably would have been smarter to turn around rather than attempt the summit. But that's something I wasn't as good at paying attention to back then. So that's something I learned. And yeah, anyway, I had a lot of fun on that trip. It was brutal, but it was also one of those trips that made me and formed me into the woman that I am today. It probably deserves its own episodes one of these days, but I'm just going to leave it at that. Okay. My next opportunity to summit Mount Whitney came in 2015 when I got invited to join a group of guys that I knew from work on a trip that they had planned from Onion Valley, which is another trailhead area in the Eastern Sierras, ending in Whitney Portal. So I believe, I don't have the stats on me right now, but it was somewhere around 45 miles. It was like over 11,000 feet of gain for the whole trip. And I remember when I got invited to that, I said yes immediately, but I was also like, I had a lot of imposter syndrome and I was desperate to prove myself on that trip because going into it, I felt like a lot of pressure to hold my own, or else like maybe they wouldn't invite me on future trips. And at the time, I was still kind of like gaining my own confidence and I didn't have a ton of friends who like doing this kind of thing. So I was in my head about it a lot, especially leading into the trip. We spent about 4 days and 3 nights backpacking this route. And it was another one of those like much harder than I expected trips. But of course, I was still getting to learn my limits. I was understanding my capacities. I was testing out harder and harder trips. So for me, it was really challenging. But, you know, I've gone back and done those same things and it's been less challenging since. So I know it was just like at the time, it was like a big part of my learning curve. And it was filled with a lot of interesting challenging as well because my friend got the permit early in the season. I believe it was like mid-June, which normally I would be like, there's no way that you're going to be able to do this without too much snow. So one of the biggest question marks we had leading into the trip was, will there be too much snow, period? But it did end up being kind of a really low snow year for California. So then it really became, we knew like we could probably get started on the trip, but then it became a question mark. Would there be too much snow on Forester Pass, which is about 13,000 feet? So on this trail, Onion Valley to Whitney Portal, you have to go over a pass that's at 13,000. And then you have to go to Trail Crest, which I forget the elevation of Trail Crest at the moment. But it's also very high. It's the pass basically before you get to the Mount Whitney summit. Would there be too much snow on Trail Crest? Would we have to turn around? Would it all feel too unsafe? Some of the people that I had been with, I had mountaineering experience. I think I was probably the only one with mountaineering experience in the group, to be honest. And I was the only one with really good gear for it. But, you know, so that was a question mark too. It's like, well, maybe it's safe enough to do, but maybe not for everyone. And so that's just something that was kind of in the back of our heads. So ultimately, we did complete the trip. But when we made it to Trail Crest, which again, I mentioned, was kind of like that point before you go to the summit of Mount Whitney. It's like you can go over Trail Crest and keep exiting out Mount Whitney Portal, or you can go up and summit Whitney and then come back to the Trail Crest and then exit. We opted not to summit because no one else in the group had the energy for it. And I had already done it before, so I didn't really feel like I was missing out on it. And I was tired too. So on this trip, we didn't summit, even though that was originally our intention is to get a Mount Whitney summit out of this experience. So some of the biggest lessons I learned from this trip was to prepare to pivot and fail. And we did this in advance. Like we made a lot of plans in advance because of all the question marks around the snow. One, that we wanted to make sure we brought the right gear. And then two, we were making sure that we had plans. So like, what if we got to Forester Pass and there was too much snow? Basically all of our, because this was a point-to-point trail, it wasn't like a loop or anything. Basically all of our pivot plans were like, bring some extra food and supplies just in case we have to hike back out the way that we came. So we came prepared to have the worst case scenario and maybe get to Trail Crest and then it felt too dangerous and then have to hike all the way back to, that's near the end, and hike all the way back to the other side. We would rather do that and be safe than risk it being dangerous. We didn't have to do that, but we were prepared to do that in advance. So something that is really important about that is remembering that summits are really a bonus. The real adventure when you go out there is everything else that you're doing. And I had such an amazing experience with those guys, my friends out on the trail. And again, this is one of those trips that really shaped me. I not only kept up, but I found out that I was a strong leader in the group for the group morale. Also, I was one of the only people who prepared a trip plan and any sort of GPS navigation prep. It really served our whole group. And I started to see myself more as a leader after this trip. And I learned a lot about working with a bigger group and especially to keep spirits high because we had some really low moments, long days, cold days. We got snowed on like twice during our trip because it was really early in the season. Some of our friends had some bad altitude sickness. Some of our uphills were really, really brutal. So we got to learn what it was like to navigate bigger groups, encourage people to move forward even when they're struggling, all of those things. So this was a really, really valuable learning experience for me in part of my learning journey. My third attempt of Mount Whitney was in 2020 when Michael and I decided to hike the John Muir Trail. So Michael and I signed up and got permits for the John Muir Trail. We entered south of Mount Whitney from Cottonwood Pass, hiking northbound, which isn't always the traditional way people do the John Muir Trail. It adds on a few extra days too. We planned for 22 days on the JMT when we entered Cottonwood Pass. I think it was about 3 days into our hike, we made it to the backside of Mount Whitney to Guitar Lake, and we did a summit day of Mount Whitney from the backside. We had camped there the night before. We woke up really early in the morning, very early in the morning, maybe 3 a.m. or something, because we just wanted to get up there, get back. We tagged the summit, made it back to camp to enjoy a really full, restful afternoon. And I remember this was also Michael's first Mount Whitney summit, and it was my second. And for me, the biggest lessons I learned from this trip was I highly recommend, 10 out of 10 would recommend doing Mount Whitney from the backside. It is one of my favorite ways to get to the summit of Mount Whitney. Number one, you're acclimated. So if you're coming from Cottonwood Pass, or you're coming from Onion Valley, or you're coming from Cottonwood Lakes, you are already spending multiple days at altitude at this point. And so you will probably feel pretty good when you're at Guitar Lake. And then even though you'll still notice some altitude effects at 14,000 feet, they will not be as big as some people who try to do this in a day. Also, from Guitar Lake, so you do have to, backpack out to Guitar Lake, and that is elevation gain in its own right, and it's carrying a backpack, and it's doing the miles, right? But on your Mount Whitney summit day, it's only about 3,000 feet from Guitar Lake, which is fantastic. You can do that, right? And I forget how many miles, but it's not that bad. 3K feet, we were up, down, back for lunch, relaxing at Guitar Lake, ready for a restful day to start our next day. I love doing it. It feels, in compared to attempting it from the portal side, especially if you're doing it in a day, it feels easy, relatively easy at that point, if you feel good when you're there. So I recommend doing it from that way. You also get to avoid the switchbacks, which it's not that I hate switchbacks, they're fine. But the front part, coming up Mount Whitney from the traditional way from the portal side, man, some of the trail is just granite. You're just hiking on granite for days. And that really wears on your feet and your knees. And so hiking it from the back, I feel like it's a little less pounding on your body. So, and it's gorgeous back there. So yeah, we had a pretty smooth summit day from there, and our trip went wrong in other ways after that point, but that was relatively smooth for us. And I have always enjoyed summiting Whitney from the backside. So my final attempt of Mount Whitney that I'll share with you was actually with clients. So it was my most recent attempt. We took a group of clients from our Adventurous Reinvention experience. This was in 2023. We did our very first intermediate group trip with a Mount Whitney summit was our intention. So our plan was to hike from Cottonwood Pass, make our way to Guitar Lake, and then do a back side of Mount Whitney summit. And I think it was planned 5 nights, 6 days on the trail in total. And then we were going to hike back the way we came in. But what happened is, even though we had been preparing for some weather, we expected some rain that week, we were anticipating that stuff. But what turned into, I think it was originally rains, and then it was kind of a tropical storm going to hit the coast of California, turned into a once in a every 40 to 60 year hurricane that hit California unexpectedly midway through our trip. And it impacted the mountains in a way that I've never seen that kind of weather that hits the coast impact the mountains in my time living in California. So it was something I had never experienced in my 7 years living there. And so we were initially expecting a little rain, but it got way more intense than that. We were in touch with our safety contacts, understanding how it was developing. So we weren't completely blindsided by this, but it was developing by the hour kind of thing. So I can't remember, it was our second or third day in. We talked it over We finally got some updated information that it didn't look like it was going to get better. It was going to get much worse. And we talked with the entire group, so all of our clients and obviously us guides, like we had talks about it. We talked about different options, and we decided to make a pivot and safety call and turn around and start hiking out after about 2 or 3 days on the trail instead of moving forward to Guitar Lake for Mount Whitney. And we also made the decision from the day we decided to start hiking back to find a base camp at a little higher elevation. So we could hunker down for the worst of the rain, because there was about 24 hours. It was supposed to be like nonstop rain. We were still a couple days out from the trailhead. So we hunkered down at a high spot camp when it rained for safety reasons, so that we could keep the group dry, not get overly cold and wet, since, we were still a ways out, right? Or otherwise it would have been a really, really big day, which most people weren't prepared to hike out for. So biggest lessons that I learned from this trip. I think this was such a cool experience for my clients. They got to experience what it's like to make safety calls and make pivots on the fly in the backcountry, which is not an experience that everyone really gets to have, especially with really big incidents like a once in a 40-year hurricane, right? So they got to learn about how to make those safety calls, like what went into those decisions, what were the options we gave ourselves, and really got to understand our thinking process, the guides behind that. And they also got to be part of those decisions, right? They also got to experience hunkering down for weather, which is something that you often have to do in the mountains as well. And they got to learn about safe river crossings. Since some of the water had risen a lot during our trips, we got to educate a lot about that. We also had some really magical moments that came from that experience, like walking barefoot through flooded areas, watching the forest come alive, like all the animals were preparing for the storm. So we saw marmots and all these things. So it was such a really beautiful trip. And it was probably one of my favorite Whitney trips, even though we didn't get a Whitney summit. I think personally, I know my clients really wanted that Whitney summit, really excited about it, but I always tell them summits are always bonus. We're never guaranteed a summit. I personally think they got a better experience than if we had summited Mount Whitney, because this is the type of experience that makes you 10 times a better hiker and backpacker. Because they got to do it with experienced guides, they got to see what went into those safety calls and those decisions. And a smooth summit day doesn't teach you that much. So they got to learn so much more out of this experience than if they had made it to the top of Mount Whitney. So yeah, those are some of my kind of Mount Whitney experiences. As you can see, I've only done it twice. I've been in the area multiple times. I mean, I've been in the Eastern Sierras a lot, but in the Mount Whitney zone, I guess you could technically say, not as many times. I expect I'll probably be back there again multiple times in my life as well, because I just find myself always gravitating back to the Eastern Sierras. So as you can see, Mount Whitney has a lot to offer. It's the tallest peak in the lower 48. Definitely a bucket list adventure for many people. Views are breathtaking. I feel like that goes... I don't even need to say that, but if you don't know what the Eastern Sierras look like, it's beautiful alpine lakes, jagged peaks, sweeping vistas, all the things, right? It's very beautiful, but you're not always promised views. Sometimes you can make it to the summit, like I did in my very first time I went there, and not see anything. So, you gotta be there for all the reasons, the whole adventure, the whole experience of it, right? It's also a personal challenge that pushes you physically and mentally, even if you don't make it to the summit. And what's also kind of cool is the camaraderie among the hikers on this trail, doing it from different areas. It's unmatched. Everyone is there for the same reason, to test their limits, to have a really beautiful experience in the Eastern Sierras. It's really fun. It's a really great place. I think it's a worthwhile adventure to put on your list. So before we kind of wrap up this episode, I do want to talk about some key safety considerations and way to prepare for a 14er. So first, let's talk about key safety considerations for this trail, and many 14ers actually. So the first one is altitude. Mount Whitney's altitude is no joke. I mean, it's the tallest peak in the lower 48, 14,500 feet. Altitude sickness is a real risk, even for experienced hikers, and it's not really something that you can prepare for in advance. So my top tips for altitude are planning to spend like a day at minimum, ideally multiple days if you have the time to spare, acclimatizing before your hike and spending time at elevation. So what I always did, so when I was doing the 9 to 5 thing, I would work on the week and then I would drive up maybe like Friday night to the trailhead in the Sierras. It was like 4 hours from where I lived. I would drive up and I would spend the night at the trailhead somewhere, ideally 6,000 to 7,000 feet of elevation. And I would sleep in the back of my car or at a camp if I could find like a campsite, and get that valuable like altitude adjustment sleeping at the trailhead. So, and then I would start my hike the next day. If you have more time, definitely give yourself more time, but don't be tempted to stay in a hotel the night before. Like, it won't serve you in feeling more altitude adapted. If you have a couple days, then you can even do some day hikes, like in the area at altitude and coming back down to a lower elevation to camp. So sidebar, if you could hear a dog crying in the background, that is just my new puppy. He woke up from a nap in his crate, and I think that was his way of telling me, Mom, I need to go potty. Can you please pay attention to me? So sorry about the little puppy crying in the background. That is just a reality of my life right now, is navigating puppy stuff. So back to Mount Whitney. Where was I? We were talking about altitude. So yes, acclimatize before you go is the biggest tip. I also really recommend hydrating really well before your trip. Make sure that you're drinking really well, like the week before. And like, I always recommend my clients, like, try to drink a liter of water before you go to sleep. Yes, I know you'll be waking up to pee, but I promise, like, it will make you feel better the next day. And then also during your trip, making sure you're hydrating well while you're hiking. And then another really important thing is to know the signs and symptoms of altitude sickness. So like the headache, the nausea, the dizziness, and being really aware of how you're experiencing those symptoms, especially if you've never had them before, and maybe erring on the side of caution if you don't know how your body responds to altitude sickness, descending immediately if you start, feeling these signs and symptoms of altitude sickness, and letting people know. This is also a really important thing to do as well, is if you are in a group, let somebody else know, like, hey, I'm not feeling too well, so that they can also kind of check in with you along the way. And don't be afraid to turn around. Like, there will be another day. There's been plenty of summits where I have had to turn around because I just didn't feel up to it. I felt nauseous. I knew that altitude sickness was too bad for me to keep going. So make sure to pay attention to your signs and symptoms, communicate, and be willing to turn around. Another safety consideration that we've mentioned before is the weather. The weather can change rapidly. Make sure to check the forecast. Be prepared for cold, wind, even snow potentially. Even in the summer, it can happen, like with that freak hurricane that we had, right? Thankfully, like in my past experience, the Eastern Sierras thunderstorms weren't as frequent as they are in, say, like Colorado. I feel like any peak that you attempt, you better plan to be off before, the afternoon, if not earlier, because there's always a thunderstorm. In the Sierras, I felt like it was a little bit more forgiving, but there also are thunderstorms out there too, and you need to take that very seriously. So that's something you need to keep an eye out for, watch the weather forecast in advance, and also like keep an eye out on clouds and all that stuff developing, being willing to turn around early. Ideally, maybe attempting a summit earlier in the day. That's why Michael and I, when we were doing the JMT, we left so early. That way we could just be back at camp, not even have to worry about it, right? Another thing is wildfires. This is becoming more common in the Eastern Sierras and California, in the Western US. Make sure to check for trail closures, maybe even air quality reports before your hike, especially if you're a sensitive group to the smoke. The John Muir Trail that I mentioned in 2020 that included the Mount Whitney attempt, that one got cut short for us because the whole Inyo National Forest was closed down due to fires, including Mount Whitney, further down in our trip. So we got to do Mount Whitney, but a few days later, everyone, I think we were about 12 days into our trip, everybody had to exit the Inyo National Forest area because they just closed the entire forest. It was too dangerous. Also, physical preparation. this hike is a lot. Like, you will want to really train your body for the demands of this hike. So focus on your cardio, your strength, hiking with a loaded backpack. Plan to do a lot of hiking. Create a training plan. Again, the Mount Whitney hike via the main trail is 22 miles round trip, has an elevation gain of over 6,000 feet. And again, I don't recommend you do it in a day unless you want that challenge. Like, you're excited to do the challenge of it being in a day. But if you're more interested in the summit, then I suggest breaking it up by doing a backpacking trip, even if that's from the Whitney Portal side, or you're doing it from the backside, like I mentioned, from like Cottonwood Pass or Cottonwood Lakes. I think you're going to have better chances of success if you break it up, and you'll probably enjoy it more. I think most people that attempt to do it in a day kind of really hate the experience because it's pretty tough. Obviously, they're proud of their accomplishment, but like for me, it's more about enjoying the experience overall. Like, it's obviously there's going to be challenging parts of it, but I would hate for you to like hate the entire experience. So finally, let's end this episode with some tips for planning and preparing for your very first 14er, whether that's Mount Whitney or not, right? So tip number 1 is to start with smaller peaks. If you've never done a peak before, start with smaller ones rather than Mount Whitney. Consider tackling some lower elevation peaks to build your confidence and your endurance, and just understand more about your body, your pace, and all of those things. Tip number 2 is making sure that you invest in quality gear, especially knowing what footwear that you like and layers that you need. On mountains, especially big summits, you are going to want to pay attention to having a lot of different layers, because it can be hot and then it can be very cold. It can be windy, it can rain, it can snow, all the things. You want to know and test your gear out ahead of time. When it comes to footwear, you want to make sure you've tested that, see where your hot spots might rise, so that way you get good at mitigating these things in advance. Tip number 3 is making sure you have your nutrition and hydration dialed in before your trip, ideally, right? So that's what is good about doing those day hikes ahead of time, is that you can really kind of dial in what works best for you. Making sure that you pack high energy snacks, staying hydrated throughout your hike, making sure that you're getting those electrolytes, because dehydration will really worsen your altitude sickness. So hydration is really, really key. And then as far as eating goes, I don't really count the calories. I'm always making sure I'm eating something every hour, like even if I'm not hungry. So at minimum, maybe like 200 calories at minimum or more every single hour. Or if it's really grueling, maybe even upping that to like every 30 minutes, even if I'm not feeling up to eating because of the altitude, because altitude can kind of like make you feel a little bit nauseous. So another tip there is like bring foods that are a little bit more neutral. Like sometimes people only bring bars and they just do not feel like eating a bar when they feel sick. So I really recommend bringing things like tortillas, like a neutral plain tortilla. Man, I have relied on tortillas many times in the backcountry when I have not felt up for eating foods. I also really like to have energy chews, honey stinger waffles as well. Those are really good ones for getting like the quick energy that you need. And they're relatively easy to eat even if you're feeling kind of sick, right? The key is to keep eating continuously, keep fueling your body. Don't let yourself bonk, right? And just continuously think about this on your entire hike. Also, another tip is to practice long hikes and make a training plan. So I kind of mentioned this before with the start with smaller peaks, but like start practicing long ones, especially if you're doing Mount Whitney in a day. That's 22 miles. Like I would want to know, if I were going to do a Mount Whitney summit, I would at least want to know, what does 20 miles feel like before I do 22 miles, right? Like I would be building up to it almost as if you were planning and preparing for a marathon, right? Plan the same way like you would with training for running a marathon as far as distance goes, and also thinking about your elevation gain, getting those elevation gain days in, having that experience ahead of time, right? And then finally, the last tip I'm going to share is mindset. So mental preparation is just as important as physical. Break the hike into manageable sections. Don't be afraid to take breaks, and do not be ashamed if you do not get a summit, right? Remember, only 1/3 of the people that attempt Mount Whitney get a summit, and there's always important lessons and so much like you can glean out of the experience and adventure that can be taken from any of your attempts of a Mount Whitney summit. So These are the kind of climbs that can shape us into better hikers and backpackers. So always be looking for what you can take away from each experience, even if you don't make it to the summit. All right, my friends, I just thought it might be fun to do a little bit more of a trail-specific episode today. I know that's not something I typically do, but I thought it would be fun, especially since permits are opening up for this iconic peak this month. The lottery is literally happening right now. We have a ton of Mount Whitney and 14er resources on our blog at shedreamsofalpine.com/blog. So be sure to check those out if you're planning on doing this peak in 2025. Also link some of our Whitney resources in the show notes as well. I hope this episode inspires you to take that next step, especially if you've been dreaming about doing the summit. It's definitely a dream trip for many of my clients. And yeah, I just hope it kind of like gives you the encouragement that you need to go for it, right? And if you're looking for more personalized guidance and education, especially when it comes to backpacking and hiking and like feeling more confident in your own skills, definitely be sure to check out our Backpacking Badass program or even our Adventurous Reinvention experience. I'll link resources to both of those in our show notes. So that's it, y'all. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk again soon. Bye. Hey, I wanted to thank you real quick for tuning into the show and listening all the way to the end. If you love this episode and you want deeper support in becoming a safe, confident, and self-sufficient hiker and backpacker, then head over to shedreamsofalpine.com/waitlist to learn more about our Backpacking Badass coaching program, where I teach you absolutely everything you need to know to be self-reliant on the trails and stop waiting around on others for the adventure invite. So I'd love to help you more in your journey of stepping into your adventurous identity, and that program is the absolute best place for us to start working together. So again, that's shedreamsofalpine.com/waitlist, and you can learn all about it there. So that's it for today, folks. I hope you get to spend some time outside this week, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new episode. Bye.